Welcome back, you hear Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about Ante Pavelic, the independent state of Croatia, and the Usta Shah. Now, there were a number of folks who said, why don't you or why didn't you incorporate a section on the Usta Shah in SOR, the book I wrote? To be perfectly honest, there isn't a whole lot of readily available information on that government, country, political organization. I'm not trying to make excuses. I mean, you have Croatia under Pavelic, which that book is rather vague. There's a Nationalism and Terror, which certainly is more thorough, although if you're trying to find out about the Usta Shah, for those of you who don't know, Usta Shah was a political movement of very radical Croat nationalism. It stems from the concept of an uprising or being an insurgent. By the way, if you want to get the Nationalism and Terror book, I think it's on Z Library. My girl was kind enough to find that for me because otherwise it would have been $100 on Amazon, which is ridiculous. I guess they don't have a lot of copies in print. That being noted, whenever you talk about something related to the Balkans, the history is immensely complex, and there's the risk of being too vague. So I'm not going to even pretend sitting here I'm going to tell you exactly what went down. We have to do a broad overview because this is more about the NDH, as in the independent state of Croatia, than the entire history, which is quite fascinating. It's commonly accepted that the people we know as the Serbs and Croats settled in that part of the Balkans around about the 6th or 7th centuries. Now, starting in 1925, you have a Kingdom of Croatia. This is where many of the Usta Shah drew their nationalist inspiration from. And over the years, you've got Ottoman influence, which is one of the reasons, by the way, the Usta Shah and the more radical Croat nationalists, they looked down upon the Serbs. Some of them viewed it like the Serbs were actually Croats who had just given up and, simped for the Orthodox Church. Others saw the Serbs as a separate group entirely, like a lower form, kind of a slave race. But many of those who were kind of these, Croat nationalists saw the Muslims as, well, they were actually Croats. They just converted because of the Ottomans, and they were acceptable. They can be somewhat assimilated into our mainstream movement. So it's very complex. As many of you might be aware, the Balkans has a plethora of different languages, ethnic groups, customs. One of the reasons why Croatia is more towards, I guess you might say, Catholicism, you had a lot of the Franciscan movement stationed there. And of course, Dalmatia was part of the Roman Empire, had the influence of the Venetian Republic at various points. So they didn't necessarily view themselves, even if they might be genetically, they didn't view themselves as being Slavs, as being in the orbit of Russia, the Russian Empire. No, we're more of like Roman culturally. And that fed into this idea of Croats and Serbs being separate, amongst other things. What truly heightened these differences were historical, religious, and political affiliations. So you could go down the list: Kingdom of Hungary, Austro-Hungary, Viennese politics, the Habsburgs, Russia. Let's just try to, for the purposes of brevity, take World War I. A lot of folks on the Austrian side said Serbia tried to take out Franz Ferdinand. That's oversimplification, but in any case, Russia sides with Serbia. A lot of the people in what we would currently call Croatia said, well, we're going to join with the Viennese, with the Austrians, if we choose to fight in this conflict at all. So that's already a separator. Now, after the war, there's an attempt to establish Yugoslavia, which was originally called the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Now they're saying Yugoslavia, land of the Slavs, role one. Yes, we have our different religious views, our inclinations, but we can become powerful on the world stage as a unified kingdom. Sounds good in theory, but of course, the royal family is Serbian, and there's a perception, much of it justified, that they are favoring the Eastern Orthodox Church, that they don't really basically accept everyone as a co-equal. So there were special taxes only assessed on those who were not Orthodox. You didn't get the same funding, not always the same political rights. In the 1920s, they attempt to write a constitution, and once more, that Serbian lobby limits the opportunity of the Croats, but also you had some more radical Croat politicians who said, we have no interest in partaking because we want to have our own state. And so from that period on, you've got the more fundamentalist Croats going, we're going to have this Ustasha movement, and that's going to be dedicated to creating our own republic or our own kingdom, potentially, free of the influence of Belgrade and the Serbs. The leader who emerges, somewhat surprisingly, is Ante Pavelic. He was not the most prominent Croat nationalist, but he was a good organizer. Very early on, he's sent into exile because he's suspected of trying to take out King Alexander, the Serbian monarch. He lives at the pleasure of Mussolini in Italy for many years, and from there tries to put together propaganda, attempts to take out the Serbian king. One point it was made in France, but that failed. Although later on, King Alexander is actually brought to his knees. And so that, along with the fact that Germany had decided Yugoslavia was a liability, Italy itself didn't like Yugoslavia and had territorial claims on the coast of Dalmatia, Dalmatia historically being part of the Roman Empire, having the Venetian Republic influence. So you have this confluence of factors. The independent state of Croatia, the NDH, did not come about because the people rose up in a revolution. That's what the Ustasha desired, but it never truly occurred. And it's also debatable whether the Ustasha were actually had the support of most of the populace. It was more of a, okay, this is a great opportunity because there's a power vacuum. The outcome, of course, is the NDH, or the independent state of Croatia, which, yes, was independent. Now, whether you could actually call it a sovereign nation is quite debatable because, as you see here, there's a German occupation zone, Serbia under the Germans, and then you have a lot of Italian influence. In fact, Pavelic's willingness to accept Italian claims on Dalmatia in order to come to power was actually one of the most damaging politically, because he's saying, oh, we're going to make this our own land, and all of a sudden, well, yeah, but you've got Italian troops here, you got German troops there. Part of the condition was that Pavelic would be made essentially the head of government, the Poglavnik, which was their equivalent to Duce or Führer, but there would be a king, Tomislav, who was actually the Duke of Aosta, or an Italian prince. So there again we see, oh yeah, you're nationalism for everyone, but in this case, nationalism, you get to play around in your little, limited borders, but we're the real power at hand. There was, of course, a perception amongst many Croats that it was better to have the Italian influence than the Germans, because the Germans were much less likely to forgive mishaps than the Italians would be. Once the Ustasha comes to power, there are some fairly ridiculous actions that are taken against the Serbs. Now, of course, the Muslims, less of a priority. There was some attempts at the Care Bears, but primarily it was Serbs. It's interesting because despite the fact that the Ustasha advertised themselves as being potentially Aryan in origin to kind of sate the appetite of the Germans, they made available the possibility that if you were a Serb, you could become a Catholic and you wouldn't be persecuted the same way. But that was not necessarily afforded to everyone. And if you accept the popular narrative, a lot of Serbs died pretty horribly in concentration camps. I'm not talking about just being shot, but like hacked to pieces in many cases, like creative ways of killing people. It's hard to understand what would bring that about because, again, it's Christians and Christians. But as we already know, these are rivalries that go back a long way, and it's not typical to stir it up. So it's a great shame. Right here we have Stefanak, who was the sort of Catholic bishop of Zagreb. He's a controversial figure to this day because some people say he was not sincere enough in trying to step forward and tell Pavelic that this is wrong, you have to cut it out. Although from the perspective of the Ustasha and Pavelic, it was like, this is what we have to do if we want our country to be viable long term. We have to eliminate the Serbs. So it's a very sad story, but, weirdly enough, this is ethnic politics in full force. In terms of the specific policies of the NDH, not that much different if you've read SOR from what the Romanians and the Germans were doing, which is nationalize the property of Care Bears, over Serbs, put that in the hands of the state. Some of it will get to the people, so that's kind of that National Socialism. It does damage the economy in some respects because you are going to be taking out business people, professionals in some instances, although the argument would be, okay, this is authentic because it's not just, well, we can make this as long as it doesn't mess with the economy, a la like Trump or Biden would be concerned about. Like a Democratic leader would be very, very fixated on the economy or the stock market. I always wondered, of course, if the Axis had been successful, how their economic management would have proceeded after the war. Because a lot of what the Nazis did, for example, is sort of like the old school empires where you would go in, defeat them, take a lot of their resources, put it in your treasury. You're like, are you just going to keep milking them for taxes, or are you going to at a certain point liberalize and just say, okay, promote entrepreneurship and more economic freedom? Who knows? But that is a very interesting dynamic. We know that traditional Marxist socialism fails horribly over time. You just wonder if this kind of domineering nationalistic socialism would have been different as time proceeds. You know, if you have this Axis United Europe. Who can say? Because Pavelic was not particularly well ensconced on his own, his fates were tied to those of the rest of the Axis, particularly Germany, and as the Allies start to become more triumphant, his position is less and less secure. You also have Josip Tito leading the Yugoslav partisan communists and their attacks against the Germans and against the Ustasa, and the Chetniks with Draza Mihailovic. Mihailovic is a tragic figure. For those you don't know, the Chetniks were the royalist, basically the pro-Serb monarchy Yugoslavs. And they were less inclined to directly strike the Nazis because they realized the threat of communism. But in the end, despite the lies of the Allies, oh, we're going to support you, they failed and they abandoned him. He ended up being killed by the communists after the war without any real justification, although he was a political threat. That's why they took him out. You see other instances of that where there were genuine opportunities to prevent the spread of communism right after the war, but of course we were led by Roosevelt, who was a communist himself and a sympathizer of more radical communism. So you know, it's a bit of a sad story, if you ask me. He's another person, by the way, kind of like we're talking about with Pavelic. Very hard to get any good English language sources because I'd love to do a video on him as a figure if I could. As Germany started to fall apart, Pavelic realized what was going to happen. He didn't want to become another, has-been dictator. So he took some money, fled to Austria, spent some time in Italy, used a number of different disguises, and was able to go over to Argentina, where he lived for a while. Eventually, someone caught up with him, tried to kill him. He lived a while after that attack. This is him recovering in the short term after being shot. And then he would relocate to Spain, where he died from complications of his wounds. But many of those who were affiliated or even worked with the Ustasa would be hired by the CIA for operations against the communists because they were seen to be, they were well connected to the Vatican and they were pretty fiercely opposed to the expansion of the Iron Curtain. I did forget to note a little earlier, there was an attempt by some of his cabinet members, in the case of Pavelic, in 1944 to stage something of a coup and turn the NDH in the service of the Allies. So it's possible if that had occurred that maybe Croatia would have remained more of a buffer state against the communists if that had followed through. But of course, the plot was found out and those cabinet ministers were shot. So, I mean, what can you say? There's not that much about the NDH because it was a small country. It didn't last too long. But you can still get a sense of a better appreciation for Balkan politics by looking into the history of Croatia and Yugoslavia at large. So my advice would be check out that Nationalism and Terror book if you can find the ebook. It is long, so you probably won't want to read it in one day like I did. But that will give you a good sense of what happened in Zagreb, those political movements, and what contributed not just prior to World War II, but after with Tito and some of his policies.